Hey guys, tonight we begin with something oddly grim, but in a calm, dim the lights, maybe you'll fall asleep kind of way. So go ahead, get comfortable. Maybe turn your screen brightness down just a little. Let your brain slow down. There's no rush here, nothing urgent. Just a quiet stroll through one of history's less relaxing career choices. Tonight, we're talking about what it was actually like to be a gladiator, and not the Hollywood version. Not the dramatic slow-motion sand fights with heroic music swelling in the background. No, we're talking about the real experience, the kind where things smell bad. People make questionable life decisions, and survival is more of a suggestion than a guarantee. Because as it turns out, it really sucked. Now, when most people think about gladiators, they imagine strong, confident warriors choosing fame and glory, which is optimistic. In reality, most gladiators did not wake up one day and think, you know what would be fun? Fighting strangers to the death in front of a screaming crowd. No, most of them were forced into it. Some were prisoners of war, captured soldiers who had the misfortune of losing to Rome, which, as you can imagine, was not a great career move. Others were criminals, and by criminals, we don't always mean hardened villains. Sometimes it was just people who upset the wrong official, or owed money, or existed inconveniently. And then there were slaves, which, again, not exactly a group known for having a lot of career flexibility. So imagine this. One day you're living your life. Maybe not a luxurious life, but a life nonetheless. And then suddenly, you're transported, sold, or sentenced into something called a ludus. Now, ludus sounds almost playful, like something involving games or learning. And technically, it was a training school, but it was less fun educational environment and more highly controlled survival factory. This is where gladiators were trained and owned, because yes, once you were in the system, you weren't just a fighter. You were property, owned by a manager known as a lanista. And the lanista was not exactly known for being gentle. Think of him as a combination of coach, prison warden, and business investor, because that's what you were ultimately, an investment. If you survived long enough, you could make money for him. If you didn't, well, there were always more people to replace you. So your training begins. And surprisingly, it's not immediately deadly. In fact, gladiators were often fed relatively well. Better than many poor citizens, actually. High-carb diets, lots of grains, beans. They were sometimes jokingly called barley men, which doesn't sound very intimidating, but it got the job done. The goal wasn't to make you look like a sculpted statue. It was to keep you alive long enough to fight. And oddly enough, a bit of body fat was actually helpful. It could protect vital organs, cushion wounds. So yes, the ideal gladiator physique was less modern superhero and more durable human shield. Comforting, in a way. But training itself, not relaxing. You would practice with wooden weapons, heavier than the real ones, because of course they were. Why make things easier when you can make them worse first? You trained against posts, against other trainees. You learned specific fighting styles depending on what kind of gladiator you were assigned to be. Because this wasn't just chaotic violence, it was organized, categorized, almost theatrical. there were different classes of gladiators. Some used nets and tridents. Others had large shields and short swords. Some were lightly armored and fast. Others were slow, heavily protected, and probably very tired, and you didn't get to pick your role. That decision was made for you, which means you might end up fighting in a style that completely didn't suit your body, your instincts, or your chances of survival. But hey, variety is important, right? Now, here's where things get a little strange. Because despite all this, gladiators were also a form of entertainment, which means they were kind of like celebrities, just very disposable ones. If you were successful, if you won fights, if the crowd liked you, you could gain a following. Aye, people would cheer for you, bet on you, maybe even admire you, which is a bit surreal when you think about it. One moment, you're property. The next, people are chanting your name. Human psychology is flexible like that. But don't get too comfortable, because admiration didn't equal safety. Every fight still carried risk, and injuries were common. Very common. We're talking cuts, broken bones, infections. And remember, this is ancient medicine, so a small wound could turn into a big problem very quickly. There were doctors, yes, but their tools were limited. Their understanding evolving. Let's just say you wouldn't want to rely on it. Now, not every fight ended in death. This is important. Despite popular belief, gladiators weren't always fighting to the death, because again, they were investments. Killing them too quickly would be bad business. So many fights ended when one fighter was clearly defeated. At that point, the crowd, or sometimes the sponsor, would decide what happened next, which is a slightly nerve-wracking way to determine your fate. Imagine losing a fight and then waiting, looking out at thousands of people, hoping they're in a good mood, hoping they had a nice breakfast, hoping they feel merciful today. Because if they didn't, well, that was it. And even if you survived, you weren't exactly free. You went back to the ludus, back to training, back to waiting for the next match. It was a cycle. Fight, recover, train, repeat. Not exactly a relaxing routine. Now, occasionally, very occasionally, a gladiator could earn freedom. After many victories, they might be awarded a wooden sword, a rudis, symbolizing their release, which sounds nice, a hopeful little ending. But getting there, extremely difficult. And even then, some chose to keep fighting, because by that point, it was all they knew, which is both impressive and a little sad, like finally escaping a storm and deciding to walk back into it, because at least it's familiar. And as we drift through all of this, you might notice something. This life wasn't just physically exhausting, it was emotionally strange. You were valued, but only for your ability to survive violence. You were admired, but also completely expendable. You were trained, fed, even cared for in some ways, but never truly safe. And that strange balance, that constant tension, that's what made being a gladiator so difficult. It wasn't just the fighting, it was everything around it. The waiting, the uncertainty, the knowledge that your life depended on performance, and crowd opinion, which, as we all know, can be unpredictable. Now, let's gently shift away from the arena for a moment. Let's float over to another group of people, who also didn't exactly win the historical lottery, because being a gladiator wasn't the only unpleasant role in this world. Not even close. In fact, just outside the arena walls, there were others. People who lived in the shadow of all this spectacle. People whose lives were quieter, but not necessarily easier. And strangely enough, some of them had it just as bad, if not worse. So take a slow breath. Let your mind wander just a little. Because next, we're going to meet them. And their stories are equally exhausting, just in a slightly different way. Part 2. Life just outside the arena. Now, let's gently step away from the sand, the shouting crowds, and the whole fight for your life situation for a moment. Because as exhausting as being a gladiator was, there were plenty of other roles in this world that weren't exactly comfortable either. In fact, just outside the arena, lived people who supported the system, maintained it, cleaned up after it, and in their own quiet way, suffered through it, because large spectacles don't run themselves. Someone has to organize things, feed the fighters, treat the wounds, dispose of what's left. And none of those jobs came with glowing reviews. So let's start with a group that doesn't get talked about much, the trainers. Now, at first glance, being a gladiator trainer might seem like a decent position. You're not the one fighting. You have authority. You understand the system. But it wasn't exactly peaceful, because your entire job depended on turning human beings into efficient fighters, which meant pushing them hard every day. You had to balance something very delicate, make them strong enough to win, but not so broken that they couldn't perform, which is a bit like trying to maintain a tool that's constantly being damaged. And of course there was pressure from above, from the lanista, from sponsors, from the expectation that your fighters would succeed, because if they didn't, it reflected on you, and failure was not appreciated. So even though trainers weren't in the arena, they lived with a constant low-level stress, a quiet understanding that everything could go wrong very quickly. Now, let's drift a little further to the doctors, or at least what passed for doctors. Gladiator physicians actually existed, and some were surprisingly skilled. They had experience with wounds, cuts, fractures, internal injuries. They saw it all, over and over again, which, in a strange way, made them specialists. But the environment they worked in was not ideal. Imagine trying to treat deep sword wounds without modern anesthesia, without antibiotics, without a clear understanding of infection. You're doing your best, but the tools are limited, and the outcomes uncertain. Very uncertain. Some fighters recovered, others didn't, and there wasn't always a clear reason why, which must have been frustrating, quietly frustrating, to work so closely with survival and still lose people to things that today might be easily treated. And then, of course, there were the attendants, the people who handled the less glamorous tasks, cleaning the arena, maintaining equipment, managing animals. Because yes, animals were often involved, wild ones, large ones, the kind you don't casually walk past. So these workers had to deal with danger too, just without the recognition. No cheering crowds, no fame, just responsibility. And as we slowly come to the end of this part, things begin to quiet down a little. The arena fades, the noise softens, and for a moment, everything feels still. If you made it this far, I hope your mind has started to drift just a bit. Maybe your thoughts are slower now, a little heavier, a little calmer. And if you're still awake, well, that's okay too. There's plenty more of this slow, strange history waiting ahead. So if you'd like to keep wandering through these stories with me, you can gently like the video and subscribe to the channel. No rush, of course. You can always do it later, or not at all. For now, just rest, and when you're ready, we'll continue.